Hi, I'm Dr. Tracey Long, and I've got another hopeful, inspiring story for you as part of our Healing Hearts campaign. This is for all of you frontline doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals that are on the front lines during the COVID pandemic. We honor you. I've been a nursing professor for 20 years and a nurse for over 30 years, and it is a privilege to be a nurse. Well, one thing that nurses do is we add like a stitch in the lives of people who we come in and out of their lives for just brief seconds. This story is told by an ICU nurse, Cindy Schutzman, and she tells the story of how she had been working day in, day out on her shifts with one of her favorite patients, Mr. Nunley. Well, Mr. Nunley was waiting to get a new heart. He'd been on the heart transplant list for many months and years as his old flabby heart was giving out. His family was there every day, hoping one day would bring the message that they would be getting him a new heart before they had to say a final goodbye to him. Well, it had been the end of another long 12-hour shift, and as she was ready to clock out, she said her goodbyes and hugs to the wife and the children of Dr. Nunley. And she started to walk out, and her charge nurse stopped her and said, "Hey, do you want to go see a heart transplant tonight?" She said, "Well, I'm done with my shift." And she said, "It's for Mr. Nunley." What? With renewed energy, she said, "Absolutely." She called her husband to say, "I'm not coming home tonight. I might be a little bit longer." So she was so excited, and she was going to be a part of the transplant team where they actually go to the other hospital, harvest is the term, of the heart, and then bring it back to Mr. Nunley where he would be patiently waiting in his OR to receive it. So with excitement and joy, she went and she watched all of that and then realized as she passed another nurse, there was another side to this story. Her side was excitement for Mr. Nunley and his family who were going to be getting a new heart. The other nurse represented the other side of the story where someone was saying goodbye to their family member. And in this case, it was a young man in his 30s who had been on a motorcycle without a helmet and had had a crash. It became a fatal crash, and he would be giving the last of his gifts to 5 or 7 other recipients. But out in the waiting room stood his grieving family, wife, and 3 small children. The 2 nurses stood in the gap between the story. She stood in the gap between joy and receiving life, and the other nurse, with fatigue in her eyes and in her body, stood in the gap for the grieving family that was saying goodbye. So the 2 nurses understood their roles and supported each other, and then, of course, had to move on and play those roles for each side of those 2 families. Well, this ICU nurse said it became clear to her on that day the role of a nurse, which was to be a stitch in the life that sometimes becomes unraveled, that we help keep things together when the very families and the patients that we work with are falling apart, whether it's mentally, physically, or the emotional trauma of things that they're going through, that we as nurses help stitch them back together. Sometimes life won't be the same. It will be a new, different. Well, that ICU nurse, of course, went back with the transplant team, back to Mr. Nunley's OR suite, and then got to actually watch that whole transplantation of the new heart. Seeing the empty chest cavity after the old, flabby, tired heart was removed was a no going back moment. So then the new, fresh, younger heart was placed, and stitch by stitch, it became part of his body. Well, it was a joyous occasion when that heart received its little defibrillation and started beating on its own. And of course, everyone in the OR suite began to cheer and have a deep relief of breath that it was going to take and it was going to be a part of his body. And where once had been death, now there was life at a cost. So this ICU nurse, of course, got to share the great news with Mr. Nunley's family, where they would experience that new life. Well, at the end of that evening, and now in the early morning hours, that nurse went home. And as she was driving home, she realized again the impact that a nurse had in the lives of 2 families And even though they may not ever remember their names, they would remember they were upheld by a stitch of the fabric that the nurses could skillfully put back together to hold them through their fabric of their lives. So thank you for all that you do. Sometimes it might be just that one stitch is all you can do in your 1 12-hour shift. But together, we nurses stitch and weave together the nets that hold people from falling, and stitch and hold them together when they're going through their most difficult times. Thank you for all that you do as a nurse. And so go forward and happy healing.